What if I told you that one of the most powerful tech CEOs in the world walked into court, alone? No lawyer, no defense team, just a worn notebook, and walked out a symbol of justice? This isn't science fiction. It's a true story about betrayal, power, and a quiet act of dignity that changed everything. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. We're on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to us. It's what keeps us going to bring you even more powerful stories like this one. It was just past 9 a.m. in downtown Los Angeles. The sharp sun bounced off the windows of the federal courthouse as people filed into courtroom 5. Most wore suits, a few clutched notepads, and nearly all were whispering one name: Elon Musk. When the doors opened, Elon walked in alone. No lawyers, no entourage, just a man in a slightly wrinkled dark blazer, holding a stack of uneven papers pressed against his chest like they might fly away if he didn't. His steps were calm but deliberate, and when he looked around, the room quieted just for a moment, long enough for people to notice that he wasn't flanked by a team of attorneys. Then came the murmurs, from the press row, from Novatech's legal team, even from a few spectators who'd only come because the name, Musk, promised a spectacle. He didn't acknowledge them. He walked straight to the defendant's table and began arranging his papers like someone preparing for a community board meeting. Not a federal patent lawsuit. At the bench, Judge Catherine Reynolds took her seat. She adjusted her glasses, tapped her gavel 3 times, then glanced at the docket. Elon Musk, she began, her tone even but tinged with disbelief. Are you telling this court that you will be representing yourself today? Elon looked up. Yes, Your Honor. The judge paused. Then, with a faint arch of her brow, she said, No legal counsel, not even a junior associate? No, ma'am, Elon replied, still standing. I'll speak for myself. Someone in the back chuckled. On Novatech's side of the room, lead attorney Richard Bennett allowed himself a tight smile. His tailored suit was impeccable, his silver cufflinks catching the morning light as he adjusted his notes. Well then, Judge Reynolds said, tapping her pen on the bench. Let's proceed. Bennett stood, calm, controlled, and confident. He greeted the judge politely, then turned to face the courtroom. His tone was firm but friendly, like a professor beginning a lecture he'd given a dozen times before. This case is about intellectual property theft, he said. Novatech has spent 7 years developing a proprietary voice recognition framework, technology that detects tone, cadence, and emotional intent. We filed for patent protection last year. He clicked a remote, and a slide appeared on the courtroom screen. It showed a highly technical diagram, complete with overlays and timestamps. Yet, only 5 months after our patent filing, Mr. Musk's company, Neuralink, released a system with identical architecture, down to the sequencing of the neural responses. He paced gently, letting the images speak for themselves. We have documentation, timestamps, and former employees willing to testify. What we do not have, he paused, turning to Musk, is an explanation. All eyes turned to Elon. He stood slowly, shuffled some pages, and one slipped out, fluttering to the floor. He bent down to pick it up, and a low laugh echoed from somewhere near the jury box. He didn't react. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, I have diagrams, somewhere. He fumbled through his papers. Judge Reynolds leaned back, exchanging a quick glance with her clerk. Mr. Musk, she said with the trace of a smile. This isn't a product demo. You need to present a legal defense. I understand, he replied quietly, still flipping pages. I thought it would be better if I spoke plainly. Another wave of quiet chuckles. From the plaintiff's table, Bennett watched with folded arms, confident this would be over before it even began. This wasn't an underdog story. It was a slow-motion train wreck. and the courtroom was eating it up. Near the back, one woman wasn't laughing. Lila Chen, Neuralink's chief technical officer, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, not because of the lawsuit, but because she'd seen Musk at 3 a.m. 3 nights in a row, poring over legal books, writing notes in pencil, and asking questions no engineer had time to answer. She knew the man didn't do anything halfway. And yet, right now, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building. Judge Reynolds interrupted the awkward pause. "Mr. Musk, do you have an opening statement or not?" He looked up, caught her eyes. "I do," he said. "Just give me a minute." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It was, frankly, uncomfortable to watch. And yet, somewhere behind the paper shuffle and the unsure tone, something felt off. Not wrong, off. Like watching a chess player sacrifice a queen far too early. It didn't make sense. Not yet. Bennett leaned over to his assistant and whispered, "He's done. He's walking himself right into a ruling." Back on the bench, Judge Reynolds made a small note in her legal pad. No one could see what it said, but if they had, they might have raised an eyebrow. It simply read, "Not what I expected." By the time court adjourned for lunch, it was clear. Novatech had landed the first punch. Their evidence was tight, their presentation flawless. Musk, by comparison, looked unprepared and outmatched. As people filed out, someone near the front muttered, "I thought he was a genius." And yet, as he packed up his papers with care, Musk didn't look defeated, just quiet, focused, like a man in the middle of a long equation, who wasn't done solving. It was late afternoon when the courtroom finally emptied, leaving behind nothing but echoes and the faint scent of old carpet and paper. Elon sat for a moment longer than everyone else, his hands resting on the table, eyes unfocused. His posture hadn't changed much during the entire session. He looked still, but inside, something heavier than defeat was taking root. He was no stranger to pressure. He'd spent years on the front lines of innovation, often alone, pushing ideas that sounded like science fiction into the realm of reality. But this was different. In this room, innovation didn't matter. Not intention, not purpose, just legal maneuvering and the loudest narrative. To the outside world, Elon Musk was a billionaire, a tech mogul, a man who built rockets and tunneled under cities. But the person behind those headlines was quieter than people imagined. He wasn't one for red carpets or interviews unless they served a purpose. His comfort zone was a lab filled with wires, not a courtroom lined with wood panels and skepticism. Neuralink had never been about money for him. It was about restoring voices, real ones, the kind taken from stroke victims, ALS patients, or those who never had the ability to speak in the first place. With a tiny team of passionate engineers, he had spent 3 years developing an AI interface that translated brain activity into spoken language. The goal wasn't headlines, it was human connection. And then came Novatech. They were a different beast. Polished, powerful, and impossibly present in nearly every AI-integrated product across the country. Their voice systems were embedded in phones, cars, hospitals. To many, they were the face of progress. But Elon had always seen beneath the surface. Jonathan Carson, Novatech's CEO, had come to Neuralink's modest office building 6 months earlier. He arrived with charm and a handshake that lasted 2 seconds too long. He brought 2 assistants and a smile that felt rehearsed. "We believe in collaboration," Carson had said. "Imagine what we could build together." Elon didn't need to imagine. He'd seen what Novatech did to smaller companies. Partnerships weren't offers, they were warnings. Within weeks of meetings like that, those companies either got absorbed, buried in litigation, or watched their patents appear under a new name. Elon had declined, politely but firmly. Carson had smiled again, this time with his eyes a little colder. "We'll keep the door open," he'd said before leaving. "For your sake." I hope you do too. Months later, Nova Tech filed for a patent, not just similar, but structurally identical to the one Elon's team had been refining for years. And before he could blink, the narrative had flipped. Articles circulated with headlines like, "Has Musk crossed the line?" and "Tech visionary or copycat?" Cable panels debated his credibility. Anonymous sources claimed Neuralink had been inspired by Novatech's work. The irony was thick enough to choke on. In the courtroom, that irony became a weapon. Bennett's legal team painted Elon as reckless, impulsive, someone who thought he was above the law. They described Neuralink as a rogue group of untested tinkerers trying to bypass industry standards. No one mentioned the emails Neuralink had sent to the patent office months before Novatech's filing. No one asked why a company that had never shown interest in this field suddenly had a fully formed patent. Because the story was simpler this way. David hadn't just lost to Goliath. David had been accused of stealing Goliath's slingshot. Back in his office that night, Elon stared at the wall. Lila was sitting across from him, holding her laptop, quiet for once. "They're not going to play fair," she said softly. "They never intended to." "I know," Elon replied. "You can still hire someone." She added, "A real legal team. No one would blame you." But Elon shook his head. "This isn't about the courtroom," he said. "Not just that. It's about something deeper." She didn't push. She never did when he got like that. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one. But in Elon's mind, they weren't city lights. They were connection points. Neurons. Networks. Ideas waiting to be sparked. And somewhere in that web, he saw the pattern forming. Jonathan Carson wasn't just trying to win a lawsuit. He was trying to erase the intent behind Neuralink. To make the story his. To turn a project built on empathy into a footnote in Novatech's expansion. And people were buying it. That was the part that stung. Not the lawsuit, not the headlines, but the idea that people would believe, even for a second, that he had taken the easy way. Inside the courtroom, Judge Reynolds hadn't seen a man defending his work. She'd seen arrogance. When he dropped his papers, she thought it was disorganization. She didn't see the hours he spent trying to understand the language of the law, just so he could explain truth in its terms. And now, standing on the edge of what felt like a massive storm, Elon had a decision to make. He could fight back the usual way. Lawyers, countersuits, press releases, or he could lean into what no one expected. He looked at Lila and finally said, "We don't need to convince everyone. Just the right ones." She tilted her head, unsure what he meant. He added, "Let them underestimate me. That's how we start." Day 2 opened with a thick tension in the air. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights in courtroom 5 seemed louder than usual. People filed in with quiet anticipation, some carrying coffee cups from the cafe across the street, others with phones half raised, catching images of the day's spectacle. This wasn't just a case anymore, it had become a show. At the plaintiff's table, Richard Bennett sat comfortably, confident in a way only someone absolutely sure of victory could be. He adjusted his glasses with a slight smirk, as if he already knew how the day would unfold. Behind him, a new screen had been wheeled in, prepped for Novatech's next round of evidence. When the court came to order, Judge Reynolds looked more focused than the day before, her tone brisk. "Mr. Bennett, you may proceed." Bennett stood and walked toward the display. Remote in hand, the screen came to life with a diagram, a sleek overlay of 2 neural processing units. The label, Neuralink Prototype, January 2023, flashed on one side. Opposite it, Novatech Patent, March 2023. "This," Bennett began, pacing slowly, "is not a coincidence. It's not a matter of great minds thinking alike. This is duplication, line for line." He clicked, and the screen zoomed in on a detailed structural breakdown. Identical architecture, Identical signal routing methods, even identical thermal regulation paths. He continued, it is not plausible that two entirely separate companies, working independently, would arrive at the same conclusions down to the micrometer. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her fingers interlocked on the bench. I must say, Mr. Bennett, she remarked, the level of similarity here is surprising, especially given Mr. Musk's apparent lack of documentation during development. The glance she cast in Elon's direction was sharp. A few people in the gallery turned their heads to look at him. Some shook theirs slightly, others murmured. One woman near the back scoffed audibly. But Elon didn't respond. He remained seated, scribbling something into a worn leather notebook, its corners frayed from use. He didn't look up. He didn't object. His lack of reaction was beginning to speak louder than any defense he could offer. Lila, seated behind him, leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. Her eyes darted between the judge and the screen. She watched as Bennett introduced the next piece, a witness. Your Honor, Bennett announced, Nova Tech would now like to call Dr. Harold Lynn to the stand. A man in his early 50s rose from the front row, adjusted his tie, and made his way to the witness chair. Dr. Lynn, Bennett explained, had been a senior research scientist at Nova Tech until just a few months ago. Dr. Lynn, Bennett asked smoothly, can you confirm that you were part of the team that began working on the adaptive voice neural interface as early as 2021? Yes, I can, Lynn replied confidently. We started exploring voice-to-brain response mechanisms in early trials nearly 3 years ago. And during that time, did you ever interact with Neuralink or Mr. Musk? No, Lynn answered. We kept everything internal. Would you say your work was original? Entirely, he said, nodding. The technology Musk is using is similar. Yes, but it's not his. We were on this path before they were even in the game. The courtroom nodded with the kind of weight that comes from hearing what they already expected. Judge Reynolds appeared impressed. Musk didn't react. He simply turned the page in his notebook. When Bennett concluded his presentation, the tone in the room had shifted. Confidence swelled among Novatech's legal team. Even Judge Reynolds allowed herself a thin smile as she addressed the defense. Mr. Musk, you'll have your opportunity to present a defense tomorrow. I suggest you make it count. Outside the courtroom, the media pounced. Headlines rolled out before lunch. One read, Nova Tech destroys Musk's defense in day 2. Another, more biting. Genius or thief? Musk offers no answer in court. Social media frothed with takes and hashtags. Hashtag Musk stole AI trended nationally within hours. Back in Neuralink's temporary war room, a rented office 2 blocks from the courthouse, the mood was heavy. Lila paced back and forth, her sneakers squeaking against the cheap tile. She glanced at Elon, who sat at a small desk, still writing. What are you doing? She finally asked. He looked up, slightly startled. Writing. That's it? Her voice rose. They're calling you a fraud on national television. And you're writing? He met her gaze with quiet resolve. I'm preparing. For what? We have no new evidence. Nothing to prove we had the tech first. Nova Tech buried us today. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he flipped back a few pages in his notebook, scanned a diagram, then looked at her. They're too sure of themselves. Lila, he said. She raised an eyebrow. They think they've already won. He added, that's exactly when people stop looking over their shoulder. She crossed her arms, her voice still tense. So what? We just sit here and hope for a miracle? No, Elon said calmly. We set the bait, and tomorrow, we pull the net. The room went quiet again. Lila studied him, unsure whether to believe in his confidence or fear his silence. He'd always been unconventional, but this felt reckless. Yet beneath the exhaustion on his face, she saw something else. Not delusion, not arrogance, something colder. Precise. A plan. The courthouse buzzed with an eerie kind of anticipation. Journalists lined the marble steps outside like vultures circling something that hadn't died yet. Inside, the crowd had returned. Some of them just as curious to see Elon Musk fail in spectacular fashion as others were to watch a miracle. The mood was lopsided. There were whispered bets being placed in the back benches. People leaned in, some chuckling softly, expecting a man in over his head to finally crack. The clerk called the session to order. Judge Reynolds entered, her robe swaying slightly as she took her seat. She scanned the room, eyes landing on Musk, who stood tall beside the defendant's table. Gone was the disheveled look from the first day. He wore a crisp navy suit now, hair neatly combed back, the kind of subtle change that said more than any opening statement. "Mr. Musk," Reynolds said, folding her hands, "you may begin your defense." There was a pause, just long enough to make people shift in their seats. Elon stepped forward and spoke calmly. "Your Honor," he said, voice firm but measured, "I'd like to call a surprise witness." The room rippled with murmurs. Even Judge Reynolds arched an eyebrow. "A surprise witness?" she repeated, not hiding her skepticism. "You understand this court requires prior notice for witness lists." Elon nodded. "This witness has only recently agreed to testify. Given the nature of her departure from Nova Tech, I believed it necessary to ensure her safety before bringing her forward." The back door of the courtroom opened, and every head turned. There she was, Dr. Amelia Grant, the once revered head of research and development at Nova Tech. Her disappearance from the tech world had sparked its own flurry of speculation months ago. Some said she'd taken a private role in Europe. Others whispered of burnout. No one had seen her in public for over half a year. Now she walked calmly, confidently down the aisle, dressed in a gray blazer and simple heels. She moved like someone with nothing left to lose. Judge Reynolds stared for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Very well, Dr. Grant, please take the stand." The oath was administered. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and looked directly at the jury. "I left Nova Tech," she began, "because they asked me to do something I could not, in good conscience, participate in." There was not a sound in the courtroom. In March of last year, shortly after a private tour of Neuralink's facilities, a tour that was neither logged nor authorized, senior executives at Nova Tech asked my team to reverse engineer what we had seen. They provided us with photos, sketches, and technical notes that I later confirmed had been taken without permission. "Are you saying," the judge interjected slowly, "that Nova Tech executives instructed you to steal Mr. Musk's intellectual property?" Dr. Grant nodded. "Yes, and when I refused, they reminded me of my NDA. When I threatened to go public, they made it clear my career in tech would be over." Gasps echoed through the gallery. Richard Bennett jumped from his chair. "Objection. This is hearsay. She has documentation," Elon interrupted, holding up a folder, "and recordings, all made before her departure." Judge Reynolds gestured. "Let's see the documentation." Inside were internal emails, dozens of them, subject lines like, "Fast-track replication based on Neuralink specs." Directives from CEO Jonathan Carson stating, "I want a functional copy in 6 weeks. Don't worry about ethics. That's legal's problem." The final blow came from an audio recording. Carson's voice played over the speaker system, cold and calculating. "I'm not interested in morality. I'm interested in first to market. I don't care if we step on Musk's neck to do it." Then came security footage. Carson and his assistant in a restricted section of Neuralink, clearly identified, snapping covert photographs of confidential equipment during the unauthorized tour. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Bennett looked as if the wind had been knocked from him. Carson, seated just a few feet away, turned pale. His polished facade cracked for the first time. He leaned forward, whispered furiously to Bennett, who had no answers to give. The judge adjusted her glasses. but said nothing for a moment. When she finally looked at Musk, her expression had changed entirely. Gone was the subtle contempt of days past. What remained was curiosity, and perhaps a hint of admiration. "I'll need time to review all of this," she said carefully, "but these are serious allegations, supported by compelling evidence." Musk didn't smile. He simply gave a short nod. Outside the courthouse, a fresh storm had begun to brew. Cameras flashed as Elon exited. Reporters surged forward. "Mr. Musk, did you orchestrate this testimony from the start? Were you holding back on purpose?" Elon paused for a moment, then spoke into the microphone thrust before him. No comment, but his gaze turned toward Carson, now surrounded by his legal team and looking very much like a man who had just realized the chessboard had been flipped. And in that moment, with the cameras flashing and the crowd buzzing, Elon didn't have to say it out loud. His eyes said it all. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. It started with a tweet. Within minutes of Dr. Grant's testimony, social media caught fire. One journalist posted a brief video clip of Carson's voice echoing through the courtroom speakers. "I don't care about ethics. I care about market speed." That one line was enough. By the time Elon Musk returned home that evening, the narrative had flipped. Where once he had been mocked, now he was being defended. The hashtag justice for Musk surged across platforms, climbing steadily to the #1 trending topic. Memes, think pieces, and public apologies flooded in. Overnight, the courtroom moment had become something of a cultural flashpoint. On cable news, analysts who had once rolled their eyes at Musk's courtroom performance were now revisiting their assessments. A prominent legal commentator declared, "This might go down as the most dramatic reversal in a tech lawsuit we've seen in the past decade." Even late-night hosts who had made jokes at his expense were now acknowledging they might have been too quick to judge. Inside Nova Tech, the impact was even more severe. Morale dropped sharply. Whispers began spreading in hallways and over encrypted messaging apps. Some employees had already begun quietly collecting personal items from their desks, uncertain how long their positions would last. Others were simply too ashamed to return. One of them, a young engineer named Kevin, decided to speak anonymously. Late into the night, he wrote a blog post on Medium, careful to mask his identity but bold in his tone. "We knew something wasn't right." The post read, "The sudden shift in our department's focus. The hushed meetings behind locked doors. But nobody felt safe enough to say anything, until today." Within hours, his post went viral. It was reshared by thousands and picked up by independent journalists. Other employees followed, leaking internal memos and corroborating Dr. Grant's claims. One document showed the timeline of Novatech's product launch aligning suspiciously close to Neuralink's private demonstration schedule. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Reynolds sat alone in her chambers, staring at the notes she'd scribbled in the margins of her docket. She tapped her pen against the table. In the first days of the trial, she had considered Musk arrogant, perhaps brilliant, but careless, maybe even disrespectful of the court's order. But now she saw a man who had been biding his time. A man who had risked ridicule to hold back just long enough for the truth to strike with full force. She recalled a similar case from early in her career, one where she dismissed a young woman's harassment claim too quickly, only for the full story to emerge years later. That case still haunted her. "I judged him too fast," she murmured, placing her pen down. "Am I repeating the same mistake?" Over at Novatech's headquarters, the atmosphere was heavy. The sleek glass boardroom, usually bathed in confidence and control, was now dim and anxious. CEO Jonathan Carson stood at the head of the long table, looking every bit the man who felt the walls closing in. He stared at the legal team. His jaw was clenched tight. For the first time, there was no charm, no polished tone, just a raw, unfiltered panic beginning to leak through. I want options, he barked. What's the legal ground for dismissing her testimony? I want this shut down before the next hearing. Richard Bennett, once so assertive, sat uncomfortably in his chair. His tie loosened, his expression weary. There's not much we can do, he said quietly. Her evidence was obtained legally. The exemption clause in her contract, it holds. We can try to discredit her character. Maybe delay. Delay? Carson cut him off. We're bleeding. Our stock dropped 7 points this morning. People are resigning. I just got word the Chicago office wants an internal audit. He paced the room like a caged animal. Then he stopped, turned, and slammed his palm on the glass table so hard it echoed. If we let him win, he growled, everything we built crumbles. Do you understand that? No one spoke. And if that means using the final option, so be it. There was a long silence. No one asked what he meant by final option. But everyone at the table felt the shift in the air. It was heavy, oppressive, whatever Carson had in mind. It wasn't legal, and it wasn't safe. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead, his mind torn. He had represented powerful clients before. But this felt different. This wasn't just a matter of money or reputation. This was about conscience, and his was beginning to scream. Outside, the world kept turning. Protesters began gathering outside Novatech's offices. Media vans parked like vultures outside the courthouse. People, ordinary people, were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice could prevail against giants. But in one boardroom, somewhere high above the city, a dangerous idea was forming. And its consequences were about to ripple far wider than anyone imagined. By morning, the headlines had shifted again. Novatech issued an official statement through its legal spokesperson, neatly crafted and calmly delivered. The message was clear, yet slippery enough to avoid direct accusations. Given recent developments, we believe it's possible that Mr. Musk and Dr. Grant had prior contact regarding this matter. We cannot comment further but trust the legal process will uncover the full context. It was a familiar play. Cast doubt, shift the focus, distract. Simultaneously, behind the curtain, a more insidious campaign began to move. Photos of Amelia Grant's private life began appearing on obscure gossip blogs. Images from a beach vacation. Blurred shots of her entering a therapy clinic years ago. And anonymous posts questioning her mental stability during her final months at Novatech. No direct source was listed, of course, but the fingerprints were unmistakable. A separate leak, this time through an international tech tabloid, suggested that Amelia had once received a loan from a Neuralink-affiliated charity. The implication was obvious, though wholly unverified: collusion. Even more dangerously, Novatech hired a cybersecurity firm known for its discretion rather than its ethics. Their job was to produce an analysis, proving the emails Musk presented in court had been tampered with. The firm delivered, sort of. They issued a dense, jargon-filled document concluding that metadata inconsistencies might suggest alterations. It was vague, but it sounded official enough to raise doubts. Novatech's lawyers filed a motion for a special evidentiary hearing to examine the digital evidence more closely. It was a stall tactic, but it worked. The hearing was delayed 3 days. Public sentiment began to shift again, not dramatically, but enough to muddy the waters. On social media, conversations turned from praise to confusion. Was this all more complicated than it seemed? Inside Novatech, the pressure was mounting. For weeks, senior legal counsel Lydia Moore had remained silent. She'd been with the company for over a decade, loyal, efficient, and always behind the scenes. But the smear campaign against Amelia had crossed a line. One night, in the silence of her home office, Lydia drafted an email. It was anonymous, routed through multiple channels. She attached archived server logs, original timestamps of Musk's communications with Neuralink staff, and quietly sent it to the court's secure whistleblower portal. She sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the screen, wondering if anyone would ever know it was her. Meanwhile, investors were getting nervous. 2 minority shareholders sold off sizable chunks of stock. Another, an old guard financier named Harold Green, called for an emergency shareholder meeting to question leadership. His concern wasn't just ethical, it was financial. If we go down for corporate espionage, he warned on a recorded call, we lose more than a lawsuit. We lose credibility, maybe even licensing. Carson's response was curt, I'll handle it. But inside, he was unraveling. Jonathan Carson had never dealt with a public threat like this, one he couldn't charm or crush. In his private office, he paced endlessly, chewing the inside of his cheek raw. Then came the press conference. Elon Musk stood before a modest podium in a small community center, not a sleek auditorium or corporate boardroom. There were no velvet ropes, no stage lighting, just folding chairs in a room full of reporters, camera crews, and citizens. Musk wore a simple navy jacket, no tie, and spoke with quiet clarity. I am not at war with Novatech, he said. This isn't about revenge, it's about truth, and I believe truth, given enough light, defends itself. He didn't mention the smears. He didn't address the manipulated evidence claims. He simply let the silence that followed his words stretch long enough to be felt. Even those skeptical of him began to listen differently. Back in her chambers, Judge Reynolds was furious. She had just been handed a confidential report about the attacks on Dr. Grant. While the sources were unclear, the tactics reeked of intimidation, an unspoken threat dressed up as scandal. She summoned both legal teams to a private session the next morning. Her tone was unambiguous. I'm issuing a standing order, she said coldly. Any further attempts to harass or discredit witnesses outside the bounds of this courtroom will be considered grounds for criminal investigation. She turned her gaze squarely on Carson, who had insisted on attending. If I get even a hint that your company is involved, Mr. Carson, I will not hesitate to hold you personally responsible. For the first time, Carson looked rattled. That night, long after the legal teams had gone home and the news cycle moved on, Carson and Richard Bennett sat alone in a windowless room deep inside Novatech's tower. It was the war room, normally used for high-level strategy meetings, acquisition plans, and product launch maps. Now, it felt more like a bunker. The air was still. No one else was invited. We can still win this, Carson whispered, almost to himself. We control the experts, the press, hell, half the regulators. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass and slid it toward Bennett. But the lawyer didn't touch it. Instead, Bennett stared into the dark, the lines on his face deeper than ever, the weight of weeks pressing down on his shoulders. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. We might win the trial, he said, but we're losing everything else. Carson didn't reply. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, almost like a warning. The air in Los Angeles had a different weight to it in the days following Musk's press conference. There was a kind of quiet recalibration in the way people spoke about him, as if the story they thought they knew was slipping away and something far more complicated and human was emerging. In the garage offices of a small robotics startup in Palo Alto, 3 young inventors sat watching Musk's speech on a cracked laptop. They didn't know him personally. They'd never even been close to the circles he moved in. But as the video ended, one of them, a woman with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, muttered, "He's speaking for all of us." That same evening, an open letter circulated on a well-known innovation forum. It was signed by more than 200 independent engineers, developers, and tech entrepreneurs. The title was simple. This is about more than one man. The letter didn't just support Musk. It condemned the systemic suppression of innovation by corporate giants. It told of ideas stolen, patents buried under red tape, and talents dismissed for not playing politics. Musk, they wrote, had become a symbol, not a perfect one, but a necessary one. Media coverage shifted, too, not all at once, but the tone was unmistakable. One editorial in the New York Times read, "In protecting his work, Musk has revealed something larger, a fault line in how we treat visionaries outside the system." Meanwhile, inside Nova Tech, the cracks widened. Jared Lin, a senior systems architect and one of the early minds behind the company's neural mapping software, had been silent for weeks. He'd worked under Carson for nearly a decade, loyal, focused, never once raising his voice in meetings. But that changed on a Thursday morning. He submitted his resignation with a short email. Attached was a public letter addressed not to Carson or the board, but to Musk. "I believed we were building something honest," it began, "but when I saw how quickly truth became a liability inside these walls, I knew I'd lost my way. I owe you, and myself, the courage to say that out loud." His post was shared thousands of times within hours. Industry blogs picked it up. Investors took note. More resignations followed, quietly at first, then with increasing confidence. At least 8 employees removed themselves from Novatech's key AI initiatives. One junior developer leaked documents revealing the timeline of design overlaps, showing Neuralink had built their prototype long before Novatech filed their patents. Within the court, there were shifts as well, subtle but meaningful. Judge Reynolds, who once looked at Musk as an arrogant tech magnate playing dress-up in a courtroom, now observed him with curiosity. She noticed the way he remained composed under pressure, never lashing out, never baited by personal attacks. In a rare moment between sessions, she paused Musk in the hallway. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys the spotlight," she said softly. Musk smiled faintly. "That makes 2 of us." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't believe you at first. Thought you were just here to prove something." Her eyes narrowed, searching. "But now I wonder if you're here to change something." He didn't reply, but he didn't need to. Lila Chen, watching from a few feet away, later asked him about that conversation. "She's not the same judge she was last week," she said. "No one is," Musk answered, "not even us." He had stayed the course, not out of ego, but principle. He had declined to countersue, refused to tarnish Novatech's name in retaliation, and avoided public spectacle, even when it might have gained him points. Lila had argued early on that maybe they should play dirtier. "They're going to drag us through the mud," she warned. "Shouldn't we at least throw a little back?" But Musk had shaken his head. "If we become like them just to beat them," he said, "then we lose something more important than the case." His restraint became the very reason the tide began to turn. National headlines, once dismissive or cynical, began painting a different picture. Elon Musk, from defendant to defender of innovation. Read one. Another pose. What if Musk's silence was the loudest statement in tech ethics? Nova Tech was still formidable, but their foundation had shifted. Carson's authority, once absolute, was being quietly challenged. Board members requested more updates, more transparency. The morale in Novatech's offices dipped. Rumors circulated about audits and private meetings. And in the background, a movement stirred. Not a campaign, not a rally, just the steady accumulation of stories, scientists, engineers, young inventors, sharing what it felt like to build something from nothing, only to watch it be absorbed, repackaged, or buried. They saw in Musk not a hero, but a mirror. He had failed, been humiliated, misjudged, but he had also stood still when others would have run. And that, in a world moving too fast to remember faces, had begun to matter. The buzz began days before the National Tech Futures Summit even opened its doors. It was the largest conference of its kind on the West Coast, where corporate giants mingled with indie developers. where keynote speeches shaped policy and sparked investment. It was not a place for courtroom battles. But this year, everything felt different. Rumors spread like brushfire. Jonathan Carson, CEO of Nova Tech, had registered last minute as a guest speaker. He hadn't made a public appearance since the court proceedings had turned against him. His name alone was enough to send the media into a frenzy. But what really stunned everyone was what followed. Elon Musk, despite not being scheduled, had quietly accepted an invitation to attend the summit as an observer. His name wasn't on the speaking agenda. No scheduled panel, just attendance. That alone was enough to turn the summit into something else entirely. By noon on the second day, the massive conference hall in downtown San Francisco was filled to the last seat. Cameras from nearly every major news outlet were lined along the back wall. Online streams climbed into the millions. The screen flashed. The role of corporate responsibility in future tech. Carson strode onto the stage in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his usual confident smile barely concealing the tension in his jaw. He looked thinner, older, but his voice held steady. Nova Tech, he began, has always been committed to protecting innovation, not suppressing it. The current allegations are not about justice. They are about spectacle, about turning science into drama. His tone was deliberate, measured. He gestured toward the crowd with practiced warmth. Let me be clear. This company has never stolen a single idea. We've simply outpaced our competition. And now some would rather shout than build. There was polite applause, mostly from the section reserved for Nova Tech employees. Carson stepped down with the faint smile of a man who thought he had regained the high ground. The event's moderator, a well-known industry journalist named Marcy Lang, looked out over the room. Then she turned toward the audience, her tone casual but knowing. Before we close, she said, would anyone here like to hear a response from Mr. Musk? The roar was immediate. Applause thundered. Some stood. Others chanted softly. Musk, seated quietly near the back, glanced at Lila, who sat beside him. She leaned in and whispered, "You don't have to." He didn't answer. He just stood and made his way down the aisle, unhurried, carrying no notes. The stage lights were bright. He took the microphone with a calm that wasn't rehearsed. He waited for the crowd to settle. "I didn't come here to fight," he began. "I came to listen." A hush fell. His voice was quiet, yet it carried through the room like a thread pulling everyone closer. What we build today shapes tomorrow. And if we build it on lies, shortcuts, and stolen ideas, then we shouldn't be surprised when the future doesn't work. He paused. This isn't about patents or lawsuits. It's about trust, about whether the people creating the tools that will guide humanity can be trusted not just to be smart, but to be honest. There were no outbursts, no dramatic finger-pointing, just a steady, unwavering tone. We should all ask ourselves one thing. Musk continued. Do we want a world where innovation is something you license, or something you live for? From the side of the stage, Carson shifted in his seat. His fingers tapped against his thigh. The spotlight that once bathed him now felt like a heat lamp. A young woman, barely in her 20s, wearing a university hoodie, stood from the audience and asked aloud, her voice trembling just slightly, "Mr. Carson, if you're so confident nothing was stolen, why are your own team members turning against you?" It wasn't shouted, it wasn't angry, just painfully sincere. Carson opened his mouth, closed it again. His smile faltered. The cameras captured every second. He stood abruptly and exited down the side stairs without a word. Musk remained on stage, but didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded to the moderator and returned to his seat. It wasn't victory he carried, it was stillness. After the summit, interviews swarmed him. Microphones, questions, flashes. "Mr. Musk, do you have a message for Nova Tech?" He gave a tired smile and replied, "The truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs to be seen." Later that night, one of the headlines read, "In a battle of voices, Elon Musk let silence speak." The courtroom buzzed with low whispers as Elon Musk entered holding a small, leather-bound notebook. There was no media announcement, no cryptic tweet, just a man walking in with something in his hand that nobody had expected. He placed the notebook on the evidence table and handed a sealed envelope to the clerk. His demeanor was calm, almost distant. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. When the judge returned from recess and took her seat, the clerk passed her the envelope. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "This is new evidence submitted by the defense, Your Honor," said Musk's legal assistant, now working full-time on the case. "A personal notebook, formerly belonging to Mr. Carson." Carson sat frozen, his jaw clenched so tight his neck muscles visibly tensed. His eyes locked on the notebook like it was a ticking bomb. The court technician placed a scanned version on the overhead projector. Page after page filled the screen. Handwritten entries. Dated. Detailed. One entry was dated just 2 days after Carson's unannounced visit to Neuralink months prior. It read, "Saw the interface prototype. Revolutionary. Will disrupt voice command and neuro AI interface. Must recreate quickly. Get ahead before Musk's team announces." Another line. "Amelia may be trouble. Limit her access." A stunned silence fell over the room. Judge Reynolds blinked hard, then leaned back in her chair. The color in her face drained slowly as she reread the sentences aloud. The pages matched perfectly with Amelia Grant's earlier testimony. Time-stamped emails, internal communications, even meeting logs cross-referenced seamlessly. And now, this, Carson's own handwriting. Carson's attorney, Richard Bennett, stood, but not to object. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I respectfully withdraw as legal counsel for Mr. Carson. I can no longer represent a client who knowingly misled this court." The courtroom let out a collective gasp. A news outlet live streaming the trial had over 2 million viewers at that moment. Within seconds, the screenshots of Carson's notebook were posted across every major platform. Headlines exploded in real time. Nova Tech CEO's handwritten notes confirm corporate theft. Carson's downfall. Truth in ink. Bennett resigns mid-trial. Integrity over loyalty? Outside, reporters rushed to comment. Analysts predicted a record-breaking collapse in Novatech's valuation by market close. Within hours, multiple major shareholders announced they were pulling out of the company. Some even released statements calling for Carson's immediate resignation and a full federal investigation. Inside the courtroom, Judge Reynolds took off her glasses slowly. Her voice trembled, not from emotion, but from a deep, unsettling realization. "Mr. Musk," she said, "please join me in counsel for both parties in chambers." In the closed-door meeting, her words were sharper. "I want to be clear. I misjudged you. From day one, I saw a headline, not a human being. That was my failure." Musk nodded but said nothing. There wasn't joy in his eyes. No triumph. Just exhaustion. "You walked into this court without an army of attorneys." Reynolds continued. "You were laughed at, dismissed, and yet here we are. This trial has moved beyond patents and property. It's now a lesson for our entire industry." Meanwhile, outside, a movement had taken hold. A petition titled, "Inventors First, the Ethical Innovation Act," had begun circulating online. It was spearheaded by a nonprofit founded overnight by a group of independent engineers and startup founders. Within 72 hours, it had crossed 1 million signatures. Musk, who had long avoided interviews during the trial, appeared on a livestream later that evening with an audience of engineers, students, and creators. "This was never just about me," he said. "This was about the line we cross when ambition becomes theft, and the courage it takes to stop it." He held up a copy of the notebook. "This isn't just proof, it's a mirror, one that's long overdue." As the sun set behind the courthouse that evening, Protesters outside no longer carried signs of anger. They carried candles, photos of inventions, quotes from engineers, and handwritten notes of support for every small inventor who ever felt invisible. And inside her chambers, Judge Reynolds picked up her pen, opened a fresh legal pad, and began drafting what would soon be one of the most watched closing opinions in judicial history. The final day of the trial arrived with an air that felt different from all the others. Gone were the skeptical whispers and scoffs. In their place was a quiet anticipation, like the last deep breath before something sacred was spoken. Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom with an expression that carried both weight and peace. She looked down at her bench, hands steady, voice clear. This court finds that the patent claim filed by Novatech is invalid and must be revoked. Furthermore, under the 2018 Innovation Protection Act, Novatech is hereby barred from developing or licensing any related neural voice interface technologies for a period of 5 years. A hush fell over the room, followed by a low wave of murmurs. Then she added, Mr. Elon Musk is awarded $20 million in damages, in addition to full reimbursement of legal expenses incurred throughout this trial. Reporters scrambled to send updates. Cameras outside the courthouse flared to life. Yet inside the courtroom, Musk didn't raise a fist or smile. He simply nodded once. As Judge Reynolds adjourned the session, a journalist called out, Mr. Musk, will you pursue criminal charges against Jonathan Carson? Musk paused. Then, softly but firmly, he answered, Justice has spoken. That's all I needed. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to restore trust, in our system, in our values. The words hung in the air like a final chord of a song that silenced the whole room. As the crowd filed out, Carson remained behind for a moment. Alone, no press, no supporters, no colleagues. The once unshakable CEO now sat quietly in the second row. His shoulders sunken, staring at the empty judge's bench as if it held the remnants of a dream gone cold. Outside, the world responded, not just with headlines and interviews, but with reflection. Former critics who had once ridiculed Musk on television returned to the air. Apologizing publicly, one analyst, who'd called Musk reckless and unstable, took a full minute of airtime to say, I was wrong. What we witnessed wasn't recklessness. It was resilience wrapped in grace. Judge Reynolds herself requested a private meeting before Musk left the courthouse. She stood across from him, her voice low but sincere. I misjudged you, she said. I let my bias speak louder than the facts. And you reminded me. Justice must be blind, but it should never be deaf to truth. Musk offered her a polite smile. We all forget sometimes, he replied. What matters is whether we remember in time. The next day, Musk appeared on a modest stage, not a victory rally or a press event, but a scholarship announcement at a small tech institute in San Jose. He stepped to the microphone with a calm presence and a hand resting on the podium. I've decided to donate the full settlement to fund young inventors. Not because I don't value the money, but because I value the future more. The crowd, mostly students and educators, stood and applauded, not in celebration of a man who won a case, but of a person who refused to lose his principles. A banner behind him read, For those who build with integrity. In his final remarks, Musk said, I didn't win because I was right. I won because I didn't give up on decency. And if there's one thing I hope this trial proves, it's that kindness, backed by courage, is not weakness, it's strength in its purest form. He looked out at the young faces before him. Engineers, thinkers, dreamers, and you, he added, you are the ones who will shape what comes next. Just don't forget to carry your dignity with you. As he stepped down from the stage, a teenager approached him, shy but determined. She held out a worn notebook filled with sketches and notes. My dad says you gave us back our belief, she whispered. Musk took the notebook gently and replied, Now make something the world's never seen. Back in the courthouse, the echo of the gavel may have faded, but something deeper had taken its place. A shift, a signal, a story of quiet strength that didn't need to roar to be heard. Elon Musk hadn't just won a trial. He had redefined what it meant to win at all. In the days that followed the verdict, the ripples turned into waves. Novatech's stock, once considered rock solid in the tech world, plummeted by over 40% in just 72 hours. News anchors used words like freefall and unprecedented with a stunned tone, as if the giant they once admired had turned to sand beneath their feet. At headquarters, Jonathan Carson didn't even return to his office. The board convened behind closed doors and released a short, dry statement, effective immediately. Jonathan Carson has resigned from his role as chief executive officer. But it didn't stop there. Within the same breath, the Department of Justice launched an official investigation into Novatech's business practices, citing credible evidence of corporate misconduct. What shocked most observers wasn't just the scale of the fallout, but how quickly Novatech's own people turned. More than 20 employees volunteered to testify, many of them from departments not directly involved in the scandal. They spoke not just of technical details, but of a culture of silence, fear, and moral compromise. Some used the word liberation. Congress took note. Less than a week after the trial concluded, a special committee announced an open hearing on the ethics of artificial intelligence development and intellectual property protection. Lawmakers across party lines echoed a shared sentiment: something had to change. That's when Senator Angela Cortez introduced what would later be known as the Musk Grant Act, named in honor of Elon Musk and Dr. Amelia Grant. The bill proposed new protections for independent inventors, stricter oversight of corporate patent practices, and increased transparency in tech mergers and acquisitions. We can't afford to let innovation become a tool for tyranny, Senator Cortez declared. This law isn't about one man. It's about every mind that dares to think differently. In the meantime, Musk turned down television interviews and magazine covers. Instead, he reappeared at a quiet international forum on ethical technology, held in Geneva. There, in a modest hall filled with policymakers, professors, and developers from around the world, he stood behind a simple podium and said, "Innovation doesn't need to be ruthless. It needs to be righteous. Technology should uplift, not dominate. If we forget that, we lose more than business. We lose who we are." The room fell into thoughtful silence, the kind that settles not just in ears but in hearts. Not long after, Musk announced the creation of a new nonprofit organization, the Dignity Lab. Its mission? To fund startups focused on solving real human problems, healthcare, education, accessibility, while adhering to a strict code of transparency and purpose. The response was overwhelming. Young entrepreneurs flocked to the application portal. Philanthropists pledged support. Even a few former Novatech employees offered to consult pro bono, hoping to make amends. At universities across the country, ethics professors rewrote syllabi overnight. The Musk versus Novatech case became a cornerstone case study in law and engineering classes alike. Students debated not only the legal outcomes, but the moral forks in the road. What would you do in Carson's shoes? How do we define fairness in innovation? Can ambition coexist with compassion? The press, so often hungry for conflict, found itself championing something gentler, but no less powerful. One editorial headline read, "A turning point for tech, when kindness beat control." Another, from a senior columnist known for his cynicism, simply said, "We needed this. All of us." And then came a quiet afternoon interview with a local station. A young reporter, nervous but sincere, asked Musk the one question that hadn't yet been answered. "If you could go back, would you do anything differently?" Musk looked at her, the corners of his mouth curling into a familiar, understated smile. "I'd still choose the hard road," he said, because that's the one that leads where we need to go. 2 months had passed since the verdict. Spring had arrived quietly in Palo Alto. The air was crisp, the kind that carries a promise of change without making a fuss about it. The newly opened Neuralink campus stood humbly amidst the more extravagant tech buildings nearby. No gleaming glass towers. Just a thoughtful mix of clean lines and open spaces filled with natural light. A black sedan pulled up to the curb that morning. The door opened, and a woman in her late 60s stepped out. She wasn't flanked by reporters or greeted by applause. She walked alone, holding a worn leather briefcase. The kind that tells stories if you look close enough. Catherine Reynolds, once Judge Reynolds, had returned not in robe, but in purpose. Elon Musk met her at the front entrance. Dressed simply in a gray blazer over a black tee. He smiled as if greeting an old friend, not someone who had once doubted him in a courtroom full of watching eyes. "Welcome to Neuralink, Beatrice," he said gently. They shook hands, not formally, but like two people who had walked through fire in opposite directions and somehow ended up on the same path. Inside, he gave her a quiet tour, not the glossy kind meant for cameras, but the kind where real work happened. The labs buzzed softly, whiteboards were filled with equations and hopes, and young researchers, fresh out of school, paused to smile respectfully as they passed. After a while, they sat down in a quiet lounge by a window. "I need to ask," Beatrice said, sipping her tea. "Why me? I stood in your way. I underestimated you. I even mocked you." Musk set his cup down, then leaned forward just slightly, voice steady. "Because I know you understand something most people never talk about. Not just the law, but what it feels like when the law fails you." She didn't respond at first. Her gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers curling slightly around the rim of her cup. He continued, "I know what happened to you 35 years ago. The patent, the silence, the way they buried your name while someone else got rich." Beatrice looked up, eyes misted. "How? Did you know? I read your early papers. You were brilliant, but then, suddenly, nothing. I asked around, and when I found out, I knew you were exactly who I needed, not to protect me from another lawsuit, but to protect the next generation from what happened to you." She set the tea down. Slowly, she nodded. Later that week, the Dignity Lab opened its doors officially in Silicon Valley. The building wasn't flashy. It was functional, welcoming, with wide desks and open space for minds to breathe. The inaugural event drew a crowd that no one could have imagined a year earlier: young inventors, retired judges, professors, journalists, students, even a few humbled former executives who had quietly crossed to the other side of the line. There were no speeches that rang hollow, only quiet conversations about ethics, about future, about how it all could be different if people simply chose to care more than they feared. Above the entrance to the main hall, carved into reclaimed wood, were the words Musk had chosen himself: "Technology only matters when it's built on integrity." In her new office at Neuralink, Beatrice hung her judicial robe in a glass case on the wall. She stared at it for a long moment, then whispered, as if speaking to her younger self, "This robe served the law. Now, I serve justice in a new way." Outside, the sun hit the sidewalk in just the right way that afternoon, warm, but not loud, the kind of light that doesn't force itself on you, just lets you see more clearly. And now, dear listener, maybe it's time for your own clarity. If you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or made to feel small, know this: you're not alone. There is a path forward. It's not always fast, and it's never easy. But it's real. Stand up, speak kindly, act bravely, and when someone else stumbles, help them rise. This story isn't just Elon's. It's yours too. If you believe kindness can change the world, start by sharing this story. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if this touched you, hit like, share, and let your voice join the quiet, growing chorus that says, "We choose dignity, we choose justice, we choose each other." Sometimes, justice doesn't roar, it whispers, through quiet courage, through the refusal to stoop to hate, even when wronged. Elon Musk didn't just win a lawsuit. He reminded us that integrity, when tested, can become our greatest strength. But what about you? Have you ever been silenced, overlooked, or betrayed, yet chose kindness instead of revenge? We'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this journey moved you even just a little, subscribe to Covert Truths. Because every week, we uncover the hidden battles, where dignity quietly changes the world. Your voice matters. Your presence means everything.